A black man in a clean gray suit stepped into the first-class boarding lane, quiet, composed, ticket in hand. But the flight attendant didn't see a businessman. She saw someone she thought didn't belong. Without hesitation, she blocked his path. And hours later, that same woman would walk off the plane in silence, escorted by security. He never raised his voice, never made a scene, just handed over his ticket with calm dignity. And when she slapped his hand away, he said only one thing. That one sentence changed the entire flight, because what no one realized, not the crew, not the captain, not even the passengers, was that the man she just humiliated owned the entire airline. Stay with us to see how everything unraveled at 30,000 feet. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe with the bell on for more stories like this. Denver International Airport buzzed with the usual weekday rush. Travelers moved through security lines, dragging suitcases and checking phones. The speakers overhead echoed gate announcements without pause. It was a normal morning for most people, but Darius Grant didn't move like the rest. He walked calmly through the terminal in a charcoal gray suit. Everything about him was quiet, his expression, his steps, his posture. A black man in his late 40s, clean-shaven, neatly groomed, holding only a boarding pass and a slim leather case. His presence didn't demand attention, but it drew it anyway. He approached gate C-17 where the first-class passengers were beginning to gather. Some were on calls, some stood alone. Most didn't notice him, a few did. A young white woman in uniform, Haley Monroe, stood at the podium. She wore the airline scarf tied perfectly at her collar, her blonde ponytail pulled tight. She watched him approach. Her smile faded slightly. "Excuse me?" Darius said politely, offering his boarding pass. Haley didn't take it. She glanced at him, then at his suit, then back to his face. "First class?" she asked, as if double-checking something that didn't sit right. Darius gave a small nod. "Seat 1A. She didn't look at the ticket. Instead, she pointed toward another gate behind her. "Economy is over there, sir?" There was no apology in her voice, no hesitation. Darius didn't react. He simply lifted the pass slightly higher. She took it. Then, briefly, almost reluctantly, her eyes scanned the screen. Her jaw moved, but she said nothing. A second later, she stepped aside. "You can go," she said curtly. He walked past her in silence. Behind him, a few passengers had stopped what they were doing. Some glanced at Haley. Others watched Darius walk down the jet bridge. No one said a word. But then Haley muttered just loud enough to carry, "Money doesn't always buy class." Darius didn't turn around. He didn't slow his steps. He walked straight onto the plane. Inside the first-class cabin, the lights were dim and the air was quiet. Darius stored his bag neatly and sat in seat 1A. He adjusted his cuff once, then folded his hands. He didn't pull out his phone. He didn't look around. He just sat still and calm, his eyes focused ahead. Behind the curtain, Haley lingered longer than needed. She glanced at the cabin again, then at the manifest. Her fingers hovered near her tablet. Something about him didn't sit right. She couldn't explain it. He hadn't been rude. He hadn't raised his voice. But the calm way he handled her made her feel small. Darius didn't look at her. He didn't need to. He had been here before. Too many times. This wasn't just another boarding delay. It wasn't just another comment. And for Haley Monroe, it wouldn't be just another flight. The cabin lights remained low as the boarding process continued. Darius sat in silence, his eyes fixed on the closed curtain ahead. The tension from gate C-17 lingered like a faint echo in his mind, but he didn't show it. Not on his face, not in his hands. His breathing was even steady, but inside his thoughts had already drifted backward. Years ago, he had stood in a very different line, not at an airport gate, but outside a shipping warehouse in Cleveland. He was 23, no money, no safety net. Just an idea that the future of logistics wouldn't be in trucks, it would be in tech. From that day to this one, he had worked through every obstacle. Founded 2 companies, sold one, reinvested everything. Built his own airline from the ground up with a vision. Quiet excellence. And now here he was, sitting on one of his own planes, conducting an unannounced inspection. Not as a CEO today, but as a passenger. A silent one. Outside the cabin, Haley Monroe leaned against the crew station near the galley. She wasn't smiling anymore. Another flight attendant, Kevin, walked up holding a tablet. "You good?" he asked casually. Haley didn't answer right away. She looked toward the closed jet bridge door, then lowered her voice. "Yeah, just had one try to slip into first class again." Kevin frowned. "Slip in?" She rolled her eyes. "Black guy, nice suit, but I know the type. They flash a smile and hope you won't check." Kevin didn't respond. He glanced toward the cabin. Haley crossed her arms. I mean, he's in 1A, but I'm still gonna verify. Just in case. Kevin gave a non-committal shrug and walked away. Haley stayed there another moment, her jaw tight, her fingers tapping the edge of her tablet. When she finally stepped into first class, her eyes locked immediately on Darius. He was seated calm as ever. His ticket had already been scanned. He had stored his bag. Nothing was out of order, but something about his stillness, his silence made her uneasy. She approached slowly. "Sir," she said, forcing a polite tone. "May I see your boarding pass again?" Darius turned to her. There was no surprise in his eyes, no irritation either, just quiet patience. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the pass. Haley took it, but not gently. She snatched it with a quick motion that brushed roughly against his fingers. Across the aisle, a young mother shifted in her seat. Her daughter sat beside her, watching curiously. A few rows back, a businessman looked up from his tablet. Haley scanned the boarding pass longer than necessary. The name matched the manifest. The seat was correct. There was nothing to question, but she stayed there anyway. "You traveling for business?" she asked, voice clipped. Darius didn't flinch, just flying. She handed the pass back, not softly, and it slipped slightly before he caught it. The moment was brief, but the atmosphere shifted. A tension began to build. Not loud, not spoken, but felt. Haley stepped away without a word, but several passengers kept watching her long after she passed. Something in her tone, something in her posture, it had started something they couldn't ignore. Darius placed the ticket back in his jacket and leaned slightly against the headrest. Not out of fatigue, but because he knew this flight was no longer just about travel. Something had been set in motion. The cabin had quieted since takeoff, with only the soft hum of engines and the occasional clink of glasses cutting through the air. Passengers in first class settled into their seats, reading, napping, or scrolling through devices. But for Darius Grant, peace was only on the surface. He sat in 1A, perfectly upright. His hands rested loosely in his lap, his breathing even, but his mind remained alert. He had felt Haley's eyes pass over him again and again, like she was waiting for him to make a mistake, except he hadn't. Not once. A few rows back, Haley Monroe stood near the front galley, staring at her tablet but not reading a word. Her eyes kept flicking toward Darius. There was something about his calmness that unsettled her. She couldn't explain it. He hadn't done anything wrong yet. She couldn't let it go. It wasn't procedure. It was something else. A feeling. Finally, she moved down the aisle once more. Tray in hand, she stopped near 1A under the pretense of offering refreshments. "Would you care for something to drink, sir?" she asked. Her voice stretched tight. "No, thank you," Darius replied evenly. Haley lingered. He turned his head slightly, looking up at her. "Is there something you need?" he asked, voice quiet but unmistakably firm. "I just need to double-check your ticket again," she said. The mother with a child in 1C shifted awkwardly. The businessman in 2D lowered his magazine. Conversations tapered off. A subtle discomfort began to move through the cabin. Darius didn't argue. Slowly, he reached into his jacket once again. With calm, deliberate movements, he retrieved the boarding pass and extended it toward her, and that was when everything snapped. "Why do you keep asking me?" he asked softly. "Is there a reason I'm being targeted?" The question struck Haley harder than it should have. Maybe it was the tone. Measured, composed without accusation. Or maybe it was the truth she heard in it. Either way, something in her broke. "I'm doing my job," she snapped. Her hand shot out, not to take the ticket, but to swat his hand away hard and fast. The sound was sharp, skin against skin. The boarding pass fluttered to the carpet between them. The cabin froze. Gasps echoed from all sides. The woman in 1C spilled her drink across the tray table. Someone dropped a phone. A man 3 rows back, already holding his device, instinctively hit record. Darius didn't move. He looked down at the fallen ticket. Then slowly, without rush or anger, he leaned forward, picked it up, and placed it back in his jacket. His eyes met Haley's, steady, unblinking. "You've made a mistake," he said, his voice low but undeniable, "that you can't take back." Haley's lips parted, but no sound came out. Her eyes flicked to the surrounding passengers, staring, whispering, filming. The walls were closing in. For a long second, she stood frozen. Then, without another word, she spun around and stormed toward the galley. Her steps quick and uneven, curtains snapping shut behind her. But the silence she left behind was louder than anything she could have said. Darius remained still in seat 1A. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't demand anything. He didn't need to. The cabin had witnessed everything. And nothing on that flight would be the same again. You could slice the silence in first class. After the slap, no one knew quite what to do. The plane hummed on toward Atlanta, but the cabin felt frozen mid-air in more ways than one. Conversations stopped. Eyes avoided. And every movement from the flick of a seatbelt to the shifting of a newspaper sounded louder than it should. Darius. Grant sat unmoved in seat 1A, his face unreadable. He wasn't hiding anger. He wasn't masking pain. He was simply still. But his stillness carried weight, and everyone felt it. A quiet storm waiting. Passengers whispered behind half-lowered tray tables. A mother leaned over to her teenage daughter and murmured something, glancing toward the galley. A man in a navy suit who had been watching Netflix pulled off his headphones and just stared forward, as if uncertain whether he should be a witness or stay invisible. Then came the curtain shift. From the front galley emerged Angela Ramirez, the lead flight attendant for the route, mid-50s, experienced with a calm that most storms couldn't shake. She had felt the shift in the cabin's temperature, the moment Haley returned, pale and rattled. Now she needed to know why Angela didn't make a scene. She moved down the aisle with practiced ease, offering warm towels like everything was routine. But when she reached 1A, she paused just long enough. "Mr. Grant," she said softly, crouching slightly, voice low enough for no one else to hear. "If there's anything you need, anything at all, please don't hesitate." Her words were respectful, not apologetic, but her eyes said more. "I saw it. I understand." Darius met her gaze with a slight nod. "Thank you. Ms. Ramirez?" Angela stood and moved on. But that small exchange did not go unnoticed. A few passengers watched with interest, some with relief, others with shame. What Haley didn't know, what none of the junior crew knew, was that today's flight wasn't just another leg on the Denver-Atlanta route. In seat 3C sat Carl Thomason, Senior Vice President of Flight Operations for Aero Meridian, the parent company that oversaw hundreds of airline contracts nationwide. He was in his early 60s, a former pilot turned executive with a reputation for quiet observation and swift, decisive action. Today, Carl was flying incognito, conducting a routine, unannounced inspection, and he had seen everything. From the moment Darius was stopped at the gate, Carl had been watching. He had seen the interaction between Haley and Darius during boarding. He'd heard the tone shift, and he had definitely heard the slap. He hadn't moved yet, but he was listening, taking notes, watching dynamics. The silence in the cabin wasn't just discomfort anymore. It was the kind of silence that often preceded consequences. Back in the galley, Haley Monroe clutched the counter edge with white-knuckled hands. She didn't know why she felt cold despite the warm cabin. Her stomach twisted, not from guilt, but from something else. Uncertainty. For the first time, she wasn't sure she was in control of the space she usually commanded. Angela hadn't said much to her since the incident. No subtle affirmations, no smiles, just silence. Even the other attendants avoided eye contact or kept conversations painfully short. Haley's mind raced, trying to rewrite what had happened. It was just a misunderstanding. He was acting defensive. I didn't mean to. But the weight of what she had done was no longer just hers to define. The cabin had seen it, her crew had felt it, and someone she sensed was now paying much closer attention than she realized. She peeked through the curtain, eyes locking briefly with the back of Darius's head. He hadn't moved, but somehow she knew. Nothing about this flight was routine anymore. Midway through the flight, while the engines droned steadily and tray tables held half-finished drinks and forgotten magazines, a subtle shift happened in first class. Carl Thomason rose from his seat in 3C. He didn't walk like a man with questions. He walked like a man with answers. There was no uniform marking his authority, no clipboard signaling power. But those who noticed him sensed it. The quiet gravity in his step, the way his eyes scanned the cabin with precision. He made his way to the front, slowly, his gaze lingering on 1A. Darius Grant hadn't moved much. His posture was still upright, composed. His hands rested calmly in his lap. He hadn't so much as reached for water, but there was an undeniable energy around him now. Passengers felt it without understanding why a presence that seemed larger than the seat he occupied. Carl stopped just beside him. "Mr. Grant," he said, not loudly, but the name carried like a chime dropped in a silent room. Darius looked up. A flicker of something passed between them. Recognition, mutual awareness. Carl offered a respectful nod. "Just wanted to check if there's anything you need at this time." "Anything at all, sir." Darius met his gaze, calm as ever. "I'm fine, but I appreciate you asking." A few heads nearby turned the name, the exchange, the tone. A man 2 rows back froze mid-sip. A woman fumbled with her phone, suddenly remembering a headline she'd read just weeks ago. SkyNorth Airlines welcomes back founder Darius Grant after successful expansion merger. Whispers started quietly. That's the CEO. No way. That's him. I thought he was based in Seattle. What's he doing flying commercial? From behind the curtain at the galley, Haley. Monroe stiffened. She hadn't heard the full conversation, but she'd caught enough Mr. Grant. Her fingers curled tightly around the service tray she'd been wiping for the 3rd time. Her heart climbed into her throat as she leaned slightly toward the gap in the curtain peeking through. And there he was, calm, composed, speaking with the one person on board who had the power to summon corporate gravity mid-air. Her skin went cold. The pieces began to fall like dominoes. His confidence at the gate, his patience under pressure, the way Angela the lead had addressed him carefully. And now Carl Thomason, who she only knew by name from internal bulletins, was standing at 1A, treating him with the kind of reverence reserved for no one but owners. Darius Grant didn't need to prove who he was. His silence had already said it all. Back in 1A, Darius gave a small nod to Carl, signaling the conversation was over. Carl didn't linger. He turned, but instead of returning to his seat, he walked calmly toward the cockpit. Angela Ramirez spotted him on the way and stepped aside silently. Inside the cockpit, Carl closed the door gently behind him and approached the captain. Their conversation was hushed, deliberate. "We have a high-profile executive in seat 1A, Carl said evenly. "There was an incident earlier that will require acknowledgement before we land. I'll prepare a short statement." The captain nodded, understanding the weight of what Carl was saying, not just a statement, a course correction. Back in the galley, Haley's breath quickened. She stared at the curtain, unable to move. It wasn't just about a misunderstanding anymore. It was about who she had disrespected and what that meant for everything that would follow. The plane sailed quietly over Tennessee, but tension inside the cabin thickened once again. Darius didn't raise his voice. He didn't call attention to himself, but everyone now understood something Haley had refused to see. The man in seat 1A owned the skies they were flying in. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the captain's voice broke through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our initial descent into Atlanta. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." Seatbelts clicked into place. Windows were pulled up. The hum of conversation died down. But while the plane tilted gently downward, the tension on board only climbed. Haley Monroe moved stiffly through the first-class cabin, her hands clenched too tightly around the tray. Her "would you care for a beverage" came out overly sweet, mechanical, like a line rehearsed but not lived. She didn't look anyone in the eye, especially not the man in 1A. Darius Grant sat quietly, his posture unchanged, hands folded on his lap, gaze steady on the clouds outside, not smug, not hostile, just present. Every time Haley neared his row, her breath caught. A film of sweat had begun to form at her temples. She could feel the weight of stares, not from him, but from others. The businessman from 2D who had watched the earlier exchange now looked at her with thinned lips. The woman across the aisle subtly turned her body away as Haley passed. No one was saying anything aloud, but they didn't have to. They knew. At the front of the cabin, Carl Thomason stood with the calm precision of a man used to pressure. He raised the microphone from its cradle and cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice cutting cleanly through the cabin's quiet. "Before we land, I'd like to take a brief moment to acknowledge a very special passenger on board." Some passengers straightened in their seats, others looked up puzzled. "In seat 1A, Carl continued, "we are honored to have Mr. Darius Grant with us today. Mr. Grant is the founder, chairman, and CEO of SkyNorth Airlines, the parent company of this very flight you're currently on." For a beat, the cabin froze, then gasps, audible and real. A woman dropped her phone. A man who had once glanced suspiciously at Darius now looked horrified, mouthing, "That was him," and Haley. Haley nearly dropped the coffee pot in her hands. Her knees buckled slightly. She gripped the back of the nearest seat to stay upright. Color drained from her face as the air seemed to vanish around her. Darius Grant. The Darius Grant. The man she had questioned, blocked, humiliated, wasn't just a first-class ticket holder. He owned the plane, the airline, the brand sewn into her uniform. Carl didn't offer any dramatic commentary. No embellishment, just the facts. "We thank Mr. Grant for flying with us today," he concluded and returned the mic to its place. The silence that followed was louder than any applause could have been. Darius waited a moment, then slowly, deliberately he stood. Every passenger turned to face him. He didn't clear his throat. He didn't need to. With a calm voice and razor-sharp clarity, he said, "Respect isn't a privilege, it's a standard." Just that. 7 words, but the weight of them echoed through the cabin. Haley couldn't breathe. Darius scanned the room, not with anger but with clarity. His eyes swept across every face. Some passengers lowered their gazes in shame, others nodded small signs of support of understanding too late. Then Darius sat back down without another word. It wasn't a speech. It was a mirror held up for everyone to see themselves in, and for Haley Monroe it showed far more than she was ready to face. The wheels of the plane touched down with a soft thud, followed by a gentle lurch as the aircraft slowed along the runway. Inside the cabin, no one moved. Even as the familiar ding of the seatbelt sign turning off chimed above them, passengers remained strangely still. It was as if the flight wasn't quite over yet. Captain Mallory's voice came through the speaker, but this time it wasn't the usual "Welcome to Atlanta" greeting. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his tone controlled but unusually somber. "We ask that you remain seated for a few extra minutes. We are currently handling an internal crew matter that requires resolution before deplaning. We appreciate your patience." A low hum of confusion spread through the cabin. Passengers exchanged looks. "Crew matter," someone whispered. Haley Monroe, still near the front. Galley felt her stomach twist. Her fingers gripped the service counter so tightly her knuckles turned white. Then it happened. Carl Thomason stepped forward holding a small black folder. He reached for the overhead microphone, not the one in the galley, but the one that carried weight, the one usually reserved for the captain or senior flight announcements. His voice echoed calmly. "Miss Haley Monroe," he said, "please step forward to the front of the cabin." The air shifted. Haley's name sliced through the cabin like glass. The silence afterward was deafening. She didn't move right away. Her legs refused to obey. For a brief second, she hoped maybe she had misheard. Maybe someone would say this was all a misunderstanding. But Carl was already waiting at the aircraft door, flanked by 2 airport staff in standard blue uniforms. Plain clothes, but unmistakable. With every step down the aisle, the sound of Haley's shoes on the carpet felt sharper, louder. Every passenger turned to look. None spoke. Some were angry, some were stunned. Others just watched, curious, wary, and silent. She avoided eye contact, but she could feel the heat of their stares, their questions, their judgment. She reached the front, standing stiffly in front of Carl, her posture brittle, her expression unreadable. Carl didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "In light of this morning's events," he said firmly and in accordance with company policy regarding customer dignity and professional conduct, "you are hereby removed from duty, effective immediately pending full internal review." Haley stared straight ahead. Her face was pale, her eyes glassy. "This is not a termination," he added, making his words clear for all to hear. "But you will not be operating this or any SkyNorth flight until a full investigation is conducted." There were no outbursts, no arguments, just the quiet click of a pen as Carl signed a preliminary form and passed it to the waiting airport personnel. They stepped forward. Haley nodded once barely and turned without a word. The walk back down the jet bridge felt like a lifetime. No one clapped. No one cheered. They simply watched. Watched a uniform that once stood for authority now represent something else. Assumption, arrogance, and the cost of both. From his seat in 1A, Darius Grant remained still. He didn't gloat. He didn't glance at her as she passed. But when their paths briefly aligned near the threshold of the open cabin door, she caught the corner of his calm expression. It wasn't angry. It was disappointed. And somehow that was worse. As the door closed behind her and the footsteps faded into the terminal, the passengers slowly began to stir. But the atmosphere hadn't reset. It hadn't lightened, because no one on that plane would forget what they had just witnessed. And for Haley Monroe, the flight was over, but the reckoning had only just begun. The terminal was still waking up to the rush of arriving flights and early travelers, but for those just stepping off Flight 227, the atmosphere felt unusually subdued. Angela Ramirez, the senior flight attendant, waited until most of the passengers had cleared the jet bridge. She walked quietly toward seat 1A, where Darius Grant remained seated, calmly gathering his belongings. "Mr. Grant," she said gently, "before you go, I just wanted to say, Thank you. Darius looked up, his expression warm but measured. For what? He asked, his voice quiet. Angela hesitated. For staying calm? For not escalating? For showing restraint, even when you had every right not to? He gave a faint nod, his tone reflective. This wasn't the first time, he said, but it might have been the most visible. Angela's face tightened. It shouldn't happen at all. No, Darius agreed. But it does. And sometimes, the lesson only lands when it's uncomfortable enough to echo. They stood there in silence for a moment, two professionals who had seen the best and worst of people at 36,000 feet. Angela finally stepped aside, letting Darius exit without further words. Meanwhile, across town, the corporate headquarters of SkyNorth Airlines sat in a sleek tower of glass and steel. But the walls inside the employee disciplinary review room felt more like stone. Haley Monroe sat stiffly at the center of a long table, her once crisp uniform now replaced by a plain gray blouse. Across from her sat three individuals, an HR executive, a compliance officer, and a senior representative from the Flight Standards Board. To her right sat a company attorney. The evidence had already been gathered: cabin surveillance footage, audio logs, written passenger complaints, and at least 2 videos recorded by customers, one of which had already started circulating online. There was no need for speculation. Everything was documented. Each time her voice rose, each time she touched Darius's hand aggressively, the moment she slapped his boarding pass away, and most damning of all, the expression on her face, a sneer laced with disdain, even as she tried to hide it behind a professional mask. The HR executive read aloud from one complaint. She treated him like he didn't belong. Even after he showed his ticket, it was like she needed him to prove himself, again and again. It was dehumanizing. Haley sat frozen, trying not to react. But her mind wasn't frozen. It was reeling. In the stillness of her thoughts, flashbacks began to surface. Training day, a seminar on unconscious bias. She had half listened, scrolled through her phone under the table. It didn't apply to her, or so she'd thought. Her father's words echoed from childhood. You can always tell when someone doesn't belong by the way they act, the way they dress, the way they look. Had she carried that mindset into every gate, every aisle? She remembered being praised for high standards, being told she kept first class clean. She had worn that praise like armor, but now she saw it for what it was. Code. Polite excuses wrapped around dangerous thinking. Haley blinked hard, trying to focus. The compliance officer asked her to respond. Her throat tightened. Made assumptions, she said, voice hoarse. I handled the situation poorly. I let my own biases cloud my judgment. No excuses, no justification, just the beginning of a long, painful recognition. Across the table, the HR executive didn't soften. This isn't just about poor judgment, Miss Monroe. It's about misuse of authority, racial bias, and professional misconduct in front of customers and your own team. Do you understand that? Haley nodded once slowly. She understood now. The uniform didn't make her better. The title didn't make her right. And the moment she let bias guide her hand, she didn't just fail. Darius Grant, she failed the profession entirely. Back in the corporate tower, Darius Grant sat in a quiet conference room that felt more like a courtroom than a place of business. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across a polished table. On it lay a file folder marked with one name, Haley Monroe. Across from him sat Carl Thomason, the airline's operations executive, along with the VP of Human Resources and the General Counsel. They had already completed the internal investigation. The facts were indisputable. Now one final question remained. Carl leaned forward. Mr. Grant, he said carefully, as the victim in this incident, company policy allows you to submit a formal recommendation. Termination is on the table. Darius didn't speak right away. His hands were folded on the table, his eyes distant, not angry but heavy with thought. He had seen the video. He had read the reports. He had lived the moment, and he had every right to demand her firing. But he also knew something else. Firing her won't change anything, he said. At last, his voice low but resolute. Not if we leave everything else unchanged. The room went still. Darius continued. You want my recommendation? Then this is it. She doesn't walk away without consequence, but she doesn't get discarded either. Not yet. She goes through advanced inclusion and racial sensitivity training. Comprehensive, not a box-checking formality. He looked each executive in the eye. Make it mandatory. Make it rigorous. And don't stop with her. Make it company-wide. You want to be better? Then start now. The silence that followed wasn't resistance, it was respect. Carl nodded slowly. We'll implement it, he said. All of it down the hall. Haley sat alone in the smaller interview room, a tissue clutched in one hand, her face pale and damp from crying. Her earlier bravado, the stiff posture, the rehearsed explanations had collapsed. She had just heard the outcome, not termination, not yet. A second chance, but not a free one. What undid her in that moment wasn't relief, it was something heavier. The weight of the man she had tried to diminish, showing her more grace than she had ever shown him. That cut deeper than any punishment. The HR manager had left her with a simple question. Do you understand why he made that choice? Haley didn't answer at first. Her eyes were red, unfocused. She had replayed every second of the flight so many times the images now haunted her dreams. But now the tears came not from fear of losing her job, but from shame. From realizing what she had become. From recognizing how easy it had been to justify bias when it wore a polite smile and a pressed uniform. I do, she finally whispered. I see it now. Her voice cracked. I judged him because he didn't look like the people I'm used to seeing in first class. Because I let my assumptions speak louder than his ticket, louder than his voice, louder than his dignity. She buried her face in her hands, no longer crying out of self-pity, but out of something far more difficult, awareness. The next morning, the airline's official statement went live. It was brief but powerful. Yesterday, a regrettable incident occurred aboard one of our flights involving bias, disrespect, and a failure to uphold the standards we claim to value. We want to publicly acknowledge Mr. Darius Grant, CEO and founder of SkyNorth Airlines, for his dignity and restraint in the face of personal humiliation. Rather than seeking revenge, Mr. Grant requested sweeping internal reform, including mandatory inclusion training for our entire staff. His leadership in this moment reflects the values we must now strive to live by. SkyNorth is committed to change, starting immediately. The post went viral within hours. Thousands of comments flooded in, some angry, some reflective, many simply grateful that someone in power had chosen to build rather than destroy. Darius didn't tweet about it. He didn't post a statement of his own. He didn't need to. The silence he had carried on that plane had already echoed louder than any speech could. 3 weeks had passed. The media storm had quieted. But the changes within SkyNorth Airlines were just beginning to take root. Training modules had been redesigned, diversity and inclusion officers were being hired in every regional branch, internal forums were held, and for the first time real conversations were taking place behind conference room doors that had long been closed. And Darius Grant. He wasn't giving interviews, he wasn't attending press conferences, he was boarding a plane. Not in secret this time, and not alone. At Gate A3 in Atlanta's domestic terminal, he stood beside a young girl no taller than his shoulder, his 10-year-old daughter Maya. She clutched a small pink carry on her curls, bouncing as she excitedly pointed toward the aircraft parked outside the window. Is that ours? Daddy? Darius smiled. That's the one. Flight 218 to Los Angeles. He had meetings scheduled out west, part business, part legacy planning. But this trip was about more than just appointments. It was about reminding his daughter, and maybe even himself, that the sky still belonged to them. As they approached the gate, a flight attendant glanced up, then immediately straightened. She smiled warmly. Mr. Grant, welcome aboard, sir. No hesitation, no second glances. A gate agent stepped forward to help Maya with her bag, addressing her directly. You must be Maya. First time flying with us? Maya beamed. Nope. Second. But it's my first time in first class. The staff chuckled gently, and Darius gave them a nod of quiet appreciation. There were no grand gestures, no red carpets, just simple respect, the kind that should have always been there. Elsewhere that morning, another SkyNorth flight was preparing for takeoff, this one bound for Salt Lake City. At the rear galley, Haley Monroe stood with a checklist in hand, her name badge smaller now, her posture a little less rigid, a little more aware. She didn't chatter with the crew like before, she observed more, listened more. Since returning from suspension, she had passed the mandatory retraining program. Not just completed it, but stayed late after sessions, volunteered for additional reading, and requested mentoring from senior flight leads. Her probation wasn't over. Trust wasn't fully rebuilt, but she showed up every shift ready to work, this time with her eyes open. A nervous junior attendant leaned toward her. Did you really fly with the CEO? Haley gave a small nod. I did. What was he like? She paused, searching for the right words. Graceful, she said. Stronger than anyone I've ever met. Then she returned to her pre-flight checks, no longer trying to control the cabin, just trying to do the job right. Back on Flight 218, Darius settled into Seat 2A while Maya curled into her window seat beside him, already asking about snacks and whether the clouds looked different over California. The captain's voice came over the intercom with the usual welcome. But this time, Darius heard something new in the tone. Warmth, not formality. He glanced down at his daughter, who had begun sketching airplanes on the back of her coloring book. Her small fingers moved with joy, unaware of the storm that had passed just weeks ago. That was how it should be. As the wheels lifted off the runway, Maya looked up. Are we flying yet? We are, Darius said softly. Out the window. The airport shrank beneath them, the clouds stretching wide and white across the sky. He placed a hand on Maya's shoulder, steady and proud. Change is slow, he thought. But it's possible, one flight at a time. If this story moved you, please like, comment, and subscribe for more inspiring stories. This story shows that bias and arrogance lead to painful consequences, while grace, restraint, and quiet strength can transform not only moments, but lives. It reminds us that racial prejudice and unconscious bias still exist even in places meant to serve everyone equally. Such incidents still happen in airlines, offices, courtrooms, and daily interactions across America. In our personal lives, we should pause before we judge and listen before we react. In the workplace, we must create space for every voice to be heard with fairness and dignity. As a community, we must hold ourselves accountable and educate one another toward deeper understanding. By practicing respect and humility, we build a more inclusive and just society. One action, one conversation, one flight at a time.